You are listening to the Intrepid radio program with Scotty Roberts. Intelligent Talk.
Well, here it is, folks. It's Friday. We made it through another week successfully. This is Scotty Roberts. You're listening to the Intrepid radio program right here on Odyssey Radio Network. That's ODYSY1.com. Go over there and find out everything that is Odyssey Radio, all their goodness, and all the places you can find this show being broadcast live. And also, come on over to my YouTube channel to watch the video simulcast over at youtube.com/Mr. Scotty Roberts. I want to thank you all for being here. I appreciate your time, and you've all become a family over here, especially over on the video chat, where I get to interact with you a little more personally, and I appreciate your presence here. Now, I will start this show by saying something. There was a little feedback that came back to me, and it concerns me, but I want you to know that it reached my ears, and I'm going to address it. And that is, there were some people who very respectfully had something to say about some of the language I use on this show. Now, because we're a radio broadcast, there are certainly things I cannot say on this show. I cannot say certain words, like the F-bomb, although there have been times I know where I have let it slip, and I haven't been pink-slipped yet, so we're okay. I think those get bleeped out on air. So I do say the word, the shit word, an awful lot. And that's just the way I talk. And sometimes I think I have it in the back of my head that I'm making my point a little stronger if I call BS out loud on something, or if I use the S word. And so what I want to do here, while all of those of you watching over on the YouTube stream, you're used to it being maybe a little freer over there, I do have some regulations on radio, on air, that prevent me from getting crass or things like that. But even so, I have learned that there are some children that listen in with their parents on this show. And the last thing I want to do, parents, is prevent you from having your children hear this show. And so I will do my level best to keep my language kind of clean over here. If you want to get into some bawdy and stuff like that, you can join Rocky and I over on his show, which starts 2 hours later than this show starts, an hour after this show ends. And we get a little looser over there. We talk about weird topics, mostly because Rocky likes to talk about things that we don't talk about on this show. He's not here to defend his case, so maybe we'll talk about this on his show tonight too. So go on over there if you want to get frivolity, a little bawdiness, a little like late night television humor. Over here, I'm trying to get messages across that hopefully mean something to all of us. And we can all learn something from this. We can all become better people because of it. And if anything I say by way of language, I'm not so worried about offending people. What I am concerned about is if there's children within earshot that parents have a rough time listening to this show simply because I use certain words. And you know what? I'll do my best to refrain from that. If every now and then I let slip the dogs of war because I'm in heated passion about what I'm saying, please grant me the grace and to have a slip up now and then. But for this show, let's try to keep it that way. And I'll do my level best for those of you who might have some concerns with that. For those of you who aren't concerned about that and it doesn't bother you at all, so what? Let's move on. We can all live without the expletives. I know I have children, and there's sometimes I let expletives fly, and so does my wife, who's better at it than I am. And we don't like the way that it affects our children either. So there's no reason for it in this discourse, the kinds of things I present here. And so if we want that kind of comedy or that kind of barroom brawl release of expletives, we can go over to Rocky's show and we'll have late night fun over there. I'm a decent guy by my own estimation, although I've been called an a-hole very recently by other people for things I didn't even know I did. Somebody says, I don't even talk to this guy because he's just an a-hole for something he did 10 or 15 years ago. And so I can't control that. But I don't want this show to be epitomized by things that people might have a problem with and in that category. If somebody disagrees with what I say or has a different opinion and they're mad at me about my opinions, that's okay. To that I say, shut up. You know, if you want to present something, either come on and talk about it, but don't complain about it behind my back. You can write me, you can talk to me, but and that's when it comes to disagreements on topic and on things we're researching. But there you go. I think that's enough said. I don't want to belabor that point other than to say this show I will do my level best to not make it something that any parent who has a kid in the room has to worry about. You have my word on that. So having said all that, let's move on into tonight. Today's Friday the 13th. Now, I was asked by some of the higher-ups at the radio station, do I have any kind of thing with Friday the 13th that ties into the kind of study I'm doing here? And I have to say no, I don't really, because I don't think really any of that exists. There's no ties to Jesus or his birth or something with the Friday the 13th. And we all know in recent years it's really become vogue to go back to the real history of Friday the 13th, how it stems back to the Templars and what happened to the Templars on Friday the 13th, the wiping out of the Templars by the church. And so we don't have to go into that. But I thought I'd take you over. I've got a National Geographic article up here that I'm going to draw a little bit of information from, just about Friday the 13th, before we get back into our regular course of study here. And Friday the 13th, there's a word that I have had trouble pronouncing since I called this up. It's the triskaidekaphobes. Triskaidekaphobes. And so it's Triskaideka, phobes, Phobes. And that's people who have a fear of the number 13. So triskaidekaphobes. Triskaidekaphobes. Boom. So I'll try to get that one right. And it dates back, it's rooted in the Bible, frankly. And that's as close as I could come to this. So I want to cover this for you just a little bit for a couple of minutes. Triskaidekaphobes, they date back to at least ancient Roman times. But Friday the 13th, superstitions won't be getting much of a workout on certain years because it's all about the leap calendar, the leap year, to make up for that quarter day that the Julian calendar is off. And there's some years we have up to 3 Friday the 13ths. There's other years we only have 2. But the result of this all came because, the current calendar is not, it works like its predecessor, the Julian calendar, which had a leap year every 4 years. But the Gregorian calendar skips leap years on century years, except those divisible by 400. There you go on that. So if you can figure all that out, it's like math to me. Math is hard. So for example, there was no leap year in 1900, but there was one in 2000. So the trick is to keep the calendar in tune with the seasons. Where have we heard that before? The result is an ordering of days and dates that repeats itself almost every 400 years. As time marches through the order, some years appear with 3 Friday the 13th, others have 2. Or like in 2011, we only had 1 Friday the 13th. So there are curious calendar encourages Friday the 13th superstitions. It's just that curious way our calendar is constructed, with 28 days in February and all those 30s and 31s, which even now, at just about 60 years old, I still have to go, what month are we in? We're in does this month have 30 or 31 days? You know, especially when you're trying to budget things or work out dates and so on. So when the 400-year order is laid out, another revelation occurs. The 13th falls on Friday more often than any other day of the week. It's just a funny coincidence. And so Richard Beveridge, a mathematics instructor, here you go. Somebody I've never heard of because I don't like mathematics and I don't care, so I don't study mathematics. The names of mathematicians generally only come up in other studies about things that I look at. He's at Clatsop Community College in Oregon. He authored a 2003 paper in the journal Mathematical Connections. There's a newsletter I'm going to rush out and subscribe to on the mathematics of Friday the 13th. And he noted the 400-year cycle is further broken down into periods of either 28 or 40 years. And at the end of every cycle, you get a year with 3 Friday the 13ths, the year before the last year in the cycle. And you also get one on the 10th year of all the cycles. Okay, you writing this down just so you can follow it in your calendar? Me, I just look up and I go, oh, Friday the 13th is going to be this week. Cool. And I move on. I don't calculate nothing. So 2009, for example, was the 10th year of the cycle that started in 2000. And so Friday the 13th superstitions are linked to this whole triskaidekaphobia. Triskaidekaphobia. So Friday the 13th superstitions are rooted in ancient bad luck associations with the number 13 and the day Friday. And this was from Donald Dossie, who's a folklore historian and the author of Holiday Folklore, Phobias, and Fun. That's almost as good as having fun with mathematics. But the two unlucky entities ultimately combined to make one super unlucky day. And Dossie traced the fear of the number 13, a.k.a. See, I can't even just let it roll off my tongue still. Triskaidekaphobia, to a Norse myth. So the Vikings were involved in this, about 12 gods having a dinner party at Valhalla, Norse mythology's heaven. And in walked the uninvited 13th guest, the mischievous god Loki, and not the Marvel Comics Loki, the Norse mythological Loki. And once there, Loki arranged for Hodder, the blind god of darkness, to shoot Balder the beautiful, the god of joy and gladness, with a mistletoe-tipped arrow. Balder died, of course. You know, you just think that shooting an arrow of mistletoe at somebody's going to make him want to kiss people? No, an arrow, it killed him. Balder died, the whole earth grew dark. The whole earth mourned, it was a bad, unlucky day. So there's a biblical reference to the unlucky number 13. Judas Iscariot, the apostle said to have betrayed Jesus, was the 13th guest to the Last Supper. I don't know how they figured that one out, but that's tradition, I guess. As for Friday, it's well known among Christians as the day Jesus was crucified. Also, some biblical scholars believe Eve tempted Adam with the forbidden fruit on, you guessed it, Friday. Perhaps the most significant is a belief that Abel, Cain's brother, was slain on Friday the 13th. Now, I don't know what kind of calendar system they had between Adam, Eve, Cain, and Abel, but it said that it happened on Friday the 13th. I don't know how they date this back. I would think you'd have to know somebody really existed to be able to find them on the calendar. Anyway, that's one of the biblical traditions. Meanwhile, in ancient Rome, witches reportedly gathered in groups of 12. The 13th was believed to be the devil himself. In modern times, many Triskaidekaphobes, I'm sure I've got the emphasis wrong in there somewhere, point to the ill-fated mission to the moon, Apollo 13. Thomas Fernsler, an associate policy scientist in, again, the Mathematics and Science Education Resource Center at the University of Delaware in Newark, said that the number 13 suffers because of its position after 12. There you go. Because it comes after 12. According to Fernsler, numerologists consider 12 to be a complete number. There are 12 months in a year, 12 signs of the zodiac, 12 gods of Olympus, 12 labors of Hercules, 12 tribes of Israel, and 12 apostles of Jesus. 13's association with bad luck, he said, has to do with being just a little bit beyond completeness, because it's the next number. The number becomes restless or squirmy. Do you know that 13, if you got 13 of anything, it's squirmy. It's a squirmy number. And it's not unlike some folks with triskaidekaphobia today. It's a superstition. And so paralyzed by the 13th superstition. Some people are paralyzed by Friday the 13th superstitions. They refuse to fly. They refuse to buy a house or act upon a stock tip. It's been estimated that in the U.S., $800 or $900 million is lost in business on Friday the 13th. Because people won't fly, they won't do business that they would normally do. Let's see, and there's an Asheville, North Carolina connection. That comes from Dossie, the historian, who's the founder of the Stress Management Center and Phobia Institute in Asheville, North Carolina. Among other services, Dossie's organization counsels clients on how to conquer Friday the 13th superstitions, which fuel a phobia that he estimates afflict 17 to 21 million people in the United States. Do you guys have a problem with Friday the 13th? Do you change any activities on your regular agenda for the day because you realize it's Friday the 13th? I don't. I'll walk under ladders. I avoid it. I don't know why. Maybe it's for safety reasons, or you got that little inkling, you're not supposed to walk under a ladder. I'm not a very superstitious person. So among other services, Dossie's organization counsels clients on how to conquer Friday the 13th superstitions, which fuel a phobia he estimates to over that 17 to 21 million people in the United States. Now, symptoms range from mild anxiety to full-blown panic attacks. Kind of sounds like Trump derangement syndrome. The latter may cause people to reshuffle schedules or miss an entire day of work. And when it comes to bad luck of any kind, Richard Wiseman, who's a psychologist at the University of Hertfordshire in Hatfield, England, has found that people who consider themselves unfortunate are more likely to believe in superstitions associated with bad luck. It's like, do you not walk under a ladder? If you spill the salt, do you take a pinch and throw it over your shoulder? If you crack a mirror, do you think, oh, great, I've got 7 years of bad luck? That can be really compounded, by the way. Imagine breaking a mirror, and you're in your 6th year of bad luck, and you accidentally break another mirror. Man, you could live your whole life in bad luck if you're clumsy. So, superstitious people's beliefs and behavior are likely to be part of a much bigger worldview. They're going to believe both that luck is a magical force and that it can ruin their lives too. So, triskaidekaphobia's architectural effects can be seen in how societies are built. More than 80% of high-rise buildings lack a 13th floor. Now, the 13th floor is actually there, but it's not numbered on the elevator. There's not a sign for it. You can go, if you're walking up the stairwell, you go from 12 to 14. Notice that? Hotels, big high-rise hotels, don't have 13th floors because of superstition. Now, many airports skip the 13th gate. Hospitals and hotels regularly have no room number 13. On streets in Florence, Italy, the house between number 12 and 14 is addressed as 12 and a half. In France, socialites, two different things. Sometimes those two things cross, socialists and socialites, known as the Quatorzians, or the Fourteeners. The Quatorzians. Now, we're not talking triskaidekaphobias. We're talking about Quatorzians, Fourteeners, once made themselves available as 14th guests to keep a dinner party from an unlucky fate. There you go, entrepreneurs. There's a great business to start. Call yourself the 14ers and advertise that anybody having a guest, if you only got 13 guests, you can hire me, I'll come out and I'll be the 14th guest. And to keep your party within the boundaries of superstition. So DePaul University's Dudley said nobody really knows why Friday the 13th has spawned so many superstitions. You've got to have something that's unlucky, and somehow they hit on 13. But all these explanations are just moonshine. There's not a whole lot to them. I think the most you can do is go back historically to the Knights Templar and their being killed in mass and arrested, burned at the stake, all of this stuff by the Inquisition back in the, what day did that happen? I don't even have that up in front of me. But you know that it all goes back to the Templars. And so now there's something that's very interesting I wanted to bring up here. And this ties more into the things that we've been teaching and talking about here. Let me look at my time. What are we doing for time? I got about a minute and a half left. So I'll just introduce where we're going in the next segment. Remember I've mentioned before that there was a lost gospel when we were talking about the 4 accepted gospels in the New Testament, but that there were over 65 to 70 that existed. One of those was the Gospel of Judas. Judas Iscariot, the 13th guest to arrive at the Last Supper. How they figured that one out, I don't know either. But the Lost Gospel tells of how it says that Jesus asked Judas to betray him. And it was hidden for almost 1,700 years. The Gospel of Judas now offers this really surprising take on Christianity's most reviled man. And I think this is going to be a little interesting. So you sit tight for 2 minutes. We're going to go out to break, and we'll be back, and we're going to talk about this. So thanks for being here. You're listening to my show, the Intrepid radio program, right here on the Odyssey Radio Network, ODYSY1.com, or simulcast in video at youtube.com/Mr. Scotty Roberts. Sit tight, be back in 2 minutes. Hey folks, thanks for sitting through the break. This is Scotty Roberts. You're listening to the Intrepid radio program right here on the Odyssey Radio Network, ODYSY1.com for all the goodness that is Odyssey Radio. And then come on over to my YouTube channel while you're listening to the show on Odyssey, and you can listen to the simulcast and watch it in video. And join the live chat room with the other Intrep heads. And that's over at youtube.com/Mr. Scotty Roberts. And so let's look into this fun stuff. Right, I'm just adjusting my mic if you're hearing all kinds of things you don't pick up audibly, but you hear the fingers twisting the metal and moving the metal gears and stuff. So thanks for being here, first of all. Now let's get back into what we were talking about. I wanted to jump into, because I think it's pertinent, but it was kind of a side issue of looking up on Nat Geo some stuff about Friday the 13th and the superstitions that we all enact, and many of us do. And it gave some reference to Judas Iscariot being the 13th guest, which made me think about this whole issue that we've talked about already a couple of times, made mention of the Gospel of Judas. It is one of the Gospels that was booted out of the canon of Scripture when all the bishops and all the councils started under Constantine, ran into several others to try to determine which books of the Bible were actually God-breathed. And really what it was a political thing, as we all know. Political within the church. It was the hierarchy only wanted books that supported their view of Orthodox Christianity. That's what it really came down to. So what you look at in the New Testament is something that was approved by the Orthodox Catholic Church under Constantine, the Emperor of Rome, who really placed himself as the first Pope of Rome. He was said to be the first Christian Emperor of Rome. However, we know he was about as Christian as my left foot. And so he was somebody who took the last rites on his deathbed, became baptized on his deathbed as what we used to call a fire escape from hell. After living a debauched life, one where he murdered his own son and his own wife because he thought that they were... this was after the Council of Nicaea. He went home and he murdered his wife and his son because he thought they were conspiring against him. This is the kind of guy he was, that first Christian emperor of Rome. But aside from that, there's all these missing Gospels. One of them was uncovered. It was hidden for 1,700 years, and it's the Gospel of Judas. Now, there's lots of questions as to whether or not it's authentically written by Judas. Probably not, but it was about Judas. What it does is it dates back to about the same time a lot of the other Gospels were being written, in the first couple of hundred years after the death of Christ. And Judas, what do we know about him? One of the most reviled men in Christian history. And but was Judas, in what he did to make him that reviled man, only obeying his master's wishes when he betrayed Jesus with a kiss? Do you remember that? The scene in the Garden of Gethsemane? When the soldiers came and Judas had told them, I'll show you who Jesus is in the dark up in the garden. I'll give him a kiss on the cheek. And that's what the newly revealed ancient Christian text says. After being lost for nearly 1,700 years, the Gospel of Judas was recently restored. It was authenticated and translated. The Coptic or the Egyptian Christian manuscripts were unveiled at the National Geographic Society headquarters in Washington, D.C. Now this happened way back in, I think it was April of 2006 when this took place. They unveiled this, so that's how recent this discovery is, just in the last 13 years. So what does it mean? Some biblical scholars are calling the Gospel of Judas probably the most significant archaeological discovery in nearly a century. The only known surviving copy of the Gospel was found in a codex, or an ancient book, that dates back to the 3rd or the 4th century AD. Now, if you think back to all the things we've been studying and talking about here, a lot of stuff came down. See, I almost made a slip there. I was going to use the vernacular for doo-doo. So a lot of stuff came down during the 2nd and the 3rd centuries that changed a lot of what early Christianity was teaching. And this newly revealed gospel document that's written in Coptic script is believed to be a translation of the original, a Greek text written by an early Christian sect sometime before 180 AD, which really places him in that realm of, we said, most of what you see written in the New Testament was written in the latter to the late decades of the 1st century AD and into the 2nd century. So this has got you at about 180, as they say, where the Greek text dates to. And so the Bible's New Testament Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, depict Judas Iscariot, one of the 12 apostles of Jesus, as a traitor. In biblical accounts, Judas gives up Jesus to his opponents, who later crucify the founder of Christianity, which I don't really think he was the founder of Christianity. He was the person on which Christianity was founded. I don't think he founded the movement. And there's a lot of information about that. If you go into the Bible, you can see the story and how this was enacted, how it took place. Remember, it says in the scripture, it says, Jesus said, one of you is going to betray me tonight at the Last Supper. Newsflash to the disciples. And they all started, oh, who? Which one of us is going to, is it me, Lord? Am I going to do it? They were asking. And Jesus says, the one who dips his bread in the sauce the same time as me, he's the one that's going to do it. And then it says, at that time, so Jesus broke bread and he dipped in the sauce, and at the same time, Judas dipped in the sauce. And Jesus looked up and told him, go do that thing that you were appointed to do. Now, how has Christianity interpreted that? That it was Satan in the heart of Judas that had appointed him to do this evil deed, to betray Jesus the Christ. But with the revelations from the book of Judas now, the Gospel of Judas, it says that Jesus appointed Judas to betray him, and there was a reason behind it. And so when he looks at him and says, that thing that I appointed you to do, go do it, is in essence what he was saying there. This lost gospel provides information on Judas Iscariot, considered for 20 centuries and by hundreds of millions of Christian believers as an antichrist of the worst kind. Bears witness to something completely different, this gospel does, from what was actually said about Judas in the Bible. There's a guy named Rodolph, R-O-D, Rodolph Kasser. He's a clergyman and a former professor at the Faculty of Arts at the University of Geneva in Switzerland, and he's regarded as one of the world's preeminent Coptic scholars. Now, Coptic Christianity. And he led the effort to piece together and translate the Gospel of Judas. The National Geographic Society and the Waite Institute for Historical Discovery funded this project. And it'll be, it was profiled in the May 2006 issue of National Geographic magazine. If you want to go pick that up, go look for that old issue. Now, scholars say that the text of the Gospel of Judas not only offers an alternative view of the relationship between Jesus and Judas, but also illustrates the diversity of opinions in the early Christian church. Now, that's why I think this is important to look at. Remember how we talked about how the early Christian church was very well seated in the Gnostic mysteries, not in what the Orthodox Church became. There's a quote here. I expect this gospel to be important mainly for the deeper insight it will give scholars into the thoughts and the beliefs of certain Christians in the 2nd century of the Christian era, namely the Gnostics. And that was Stephen Emil, a Coptic studies professor at the University of Münster in Germany. And by the way, in 1938, this same dude, Emil, was among the first 3 known scholars to view the Gospel of Judas, 1983, not 38, sorry, which had been discovered in Egypt in the late 1970s. So the time I was in high school was when this Gospel was first discovered. And the Gnostics, as we know from all the studies we've been doing here, belonged to pre-Christian and early Christian sects that believed that the elusive spiritual knowledge could help them rise above what they saw as the corrupt physical world. And so the Gnostic mysteries, hence the Jesus mysteries. And so this Gospel of Judas kind of rehabilitates Judas for us. And there are some people who choose to believe that this isn't really so. That's a fake gospel. It was written, but it's with a collection of all kinds of writings that came from that era and that region. And biblical accounts suggest that Jesus foresaw and allowed Judas to betray him. That's the story we've been taught. Because Jesus, because he was God, God's Son, he foresaw what Judas was going to do and allowed him to do this in order to fulfill the prophecy. He knew it was going to lead to his death. For some reason, Jesus knew he had to die, was the idea there. Now, as told in the New Testament Gospels, Judas betrayed Jesus for 30 pieces of silver, identifying him with a kiss in front of the Roman soldiers. And it wasn't the Roman soldiers, it was the temple soldiers. Later, the guilt-ridden Judas returns the bribe, throws it at the feet of the Sanhedrin, and goes out and commits suicide. Or trips over a rock and falls down a little cliff, and then his guts spew out all over the place. One of those 2 deaths. They're both recorded in the Gospels in the New Testament. But the Gospel of Judas gives a very different account. The text begins by announcing that it is the secret account of the revelation that Jesus spoke in conversation with Judas Iscariot during a week 3 days before he celebrated Passover. It's stated right in the Gospel of Judas. It goes on to describe Judas as Jesus' closest friend. We always thought that was Peter, or it was John, the beloved disciple. But according to the Gospel of Judas, Judas was Jesus' closest friend, someone who understood Jesus' true message. He understood the deeper mysteries about Jesus that Jesus was teaching, and he was singled out for special status among Jesus' disciples. He also carried the money bag. He was the treasurer of the group. In a key passage in the Gospel of Judas, Jesus tells Judas, quote, "You will exceed all of them, for you will sacrifice the man that clothes me," end quote. Now, Kesser, who was the translation project leader of the Gospel of Judas, offers this interpretation. Jesus says it's necessary for someone to free him finally from his human body, and he prefers that this liberation be done by a friend rather than by an enemy. So he asks Judas, who's his friend, his best friend, to sell him out, to betray him. It's treason to the general public, but between Jesus and Judas, it's not treachery at all, because Jesus said, "You have to do this for me." And you can imagine a teacher, a mysteries teacher like Jesus, perhaps becoming so overwhelmed with his own mission, so overwhelmed with the world, that he says, "You have to free me from this life, this body where I'm trapped. Do this for me." And so he asked Judas' friend to sell him out. And the newfound account challenges one of the most firmly rooted beliefs in Christian tradition. It's even part of the Nicene Creed that Judas betrayed Jesus. Bart Erdman, you've heard of this guy before. Sometimes I like him, sometimes I don't. He's the chair of the Department of Religious Studies at the University of North Carolina in Chapel Hill. This gospel, he said, has a completely different understanding of God, the world, Christ, salvation, human existence, not to mention of Judas himself, than came to be embodied in the Christian creeds and canon. And there was a lot of turmoil over this. The author of the 26-page Gospel of Judas remains anonymous. We have no idea who wrote this. But the text reflects themes that scholars regard as being consistent with the Gnostic mystery traditions. Christian Gnostics believed that the way to salvation was through secret knowledge delivered by Jesus to his inner circle. This knowledge, they believed, revealed how people could escape the prisons of their material bodies and return to the spiritual realm from which they came. Gnostic sects looked to their Gospels, among them the Gospel of Mary, newly famous for its role in the bestseller The Da Vinci Code, to authenticate their distinctive beliefs and their practices. There's all these other Gospels out there. And now, contradicting the Gospels of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, these texts were later denounced. You recognize this from early Christianity, where the Gnostic mysteries, the texts, their writings were all destroyed and the Gnostics persecuted. The texts back that up, I'm misstating myself here. The contradictions to the existing Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John were denounced by the orthodox Christian leaders, and they refused entry into the Bible at the Council of Nicaea and the following councils that established the canon of Scripture. The scholars believe that followers of these texts hid copies of them for preservation, because they were being destroyed by the Orthodox Christian Church. Scholars knew of the existence of the Gospel of Judas because of references to it in other ancient texts as early as 180 AD. It was referenced in other texts, so we know it's at least that old. To today's biblical scholars, the Gospel of Judas illustrates the multitude of opinions and beliefs in the early Christian church. And this ancient text helps the modern world rediscover something that the early Christians knew firsthand. In the early centuries of the Christian era, there were multiple sacred texts resulting from communities in various parts of the Mediterranean world, trying to come to grips with the meaning of Jesus Christ for their lives. Now, to me, this is a really important gospel for us to understand. There are those that will poo-poo its existence or its veracity or its authenticity simply on the fact that it contradicts Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. But let me ask you a question. If you had a bunch of Gospels in front of you, 70 of them, and 4 of them had one message, and the rest of them had a different message, which direction would you tend to go, just by choice? Would you say, well, I'm going to believe these 4 over here in the way that they're stated, when we've found and we've learned that Matthew and Luke were probably both written from the same source material as the book of Mark, and that John, completely different, but came up with the same message. They all had this common source. The other Gospels were excluded for the sole reason that they went against church hierarchy and Orthodox church beliefs. And so the Gospel of Judas is very interesting, and maybe an interesting thing to look into on Friday the 13th. I think you can go over to Amazon, and you can probably look up the Gospel of Judas and find it and order it. It's a short gospel, and it'll tell you a very different story of the relationship between Jesus and Judas. And the question we have to ask is it authentic? Well, it's about as authentic as anything else we find in the Bible. And so it's to me it's not just interesting. It adds this new view to Christianity that we never knew existed before and that hasn't been taught in the church. even though this gospel was discovered in the 70s. So there's also a question that we can segue into this. Were these 12 disciples who shaped Christianity really real? Did these 12 guys exist? And historical evidence of the apostles is scarce, but some of it contradicts core Christian beliefs. In the Bible, Jesus named these 12 disciples, Judas being one of them, to spread his gospel. And the early Christian church owes its rapid rise to their missionary zeal. Yet for most of the 12 disciples, come apostles, there's really scant evidence of their existence outside of the New Testament. In Apostle Travels Among the Tombs of the 12, author Tom Bissell sets off to discover whether the 12 apostles were actual historical figures or merely characters in a fictional story. You know, there's part of this that tends to bother me at times when I say everything about early Christianity has to be questioned. Maybe none of these guys ever really existed. Maybe Jesus didn't exist. And we have to question everything that was written, everybody who existed. But this is the problem. When you have something that claims to be the one and only truth out there, you're going to have scholars looking into this to say, is this really the one and only truth? And when they start looking into the apostles, they find that they might have been some of them, parts of a fictional story that was built up to push the story of Jesus the divine. The guy who authored this book, Bissell, he walked 500 miles along the Camino de Santiago, the pilgrim route in northern Spain. He visited the place where Judas Iscariot reportedly hung himself. And he hunted in vain for a mysterious monastery in Kyrgyzstan, where, if I'm pronouncing that right, Kyrgyzstan, where the bones of the Apostle Matthew are believed to be buried. Remember, there's also the story of Joseph of Arimathea, who was not one of the disciples, but he traveled to Great Britain, Britain at the time, and he planted the holy thorn tree on the hill across from what is now Stirling Castle, and that spot. So, I'm sorry, that's at Glastonbury, across from Glastonbury Tor. And this author was trying to hunt down all these different apostles and what they did. Were the things that are mentioned about them actually true? And it's a journey that he made, and he wrote about it in his book that's full of false starts, dead ends, unsolved riddles, and it leaves him as perplexed as when he started. And Bissell explained that one of the inspirations for his book was the Monty Python film, The Life of Brian, and how his views of Christianity changed along the way. Now, that was a comedic view, but it was satire as well. You've got to, it does make you think and wonder. They try to present these views in a very satirical. If you haven't watched the movie, it's worth watching. It's kind of fun. Always look on the bright side of life. So, if there had been a New York Times bestseller in the 1st century AD, which column should the New Testament have appeared in, fiction or nonfiction? This was a question asked of Bissell. This is from an interview with him. And he said, I'm not sure if that's a distinction that would have made a lot of sense to anyone in the 1st century. There was no distinction between evangelical or evangelistic propaganda and that which the writers themselves believed to be true. And so from a modern viewpoint, it's really hard to see the 4 Gospels as unvarnished, truthful accounts. And the journalistic impulse didn't exist back then. People's partisan beliefs that magic and divinity were at work in the world were overriding everything else. And today we would call it creative nonfiction with the emphasis on creative. Remember, we talked about how the mysteries existed in the whole Mediterranean world of that day. The pagan mysteries, the Gnostic mysteries. And this is what people believed about Jesus, that he was one of those God-men. And the author of this book, again, the name of the book, if you want to look it up, Travels Among the Tombs of the 12 by Tom Bissell. And he's being asked some questions here. The interviewer says, "You grew up Catholic, but then had a crisis of faith. Wind the clock back and explain how that inspired you to write the book." And Bissell says, "I did not have a crisis of faith so much as I had just read a few books that made me realize, wow, none of this stuff is probably true in any way that I thought it was." Isn't that a point where a lot of us come to when we start thinking through these things? Now, we've got a minute left at most here, so let me just end it with that. We might pick this up again on Monday because it's Friday today, but isn't this interesting, this whole Gospel of Judas thing? How that sheds the relationship between Jesus and Judas in a different light. It sheds who Judas was in a very different light. If it was Jesus himself who asked him to do this, to free him from this body, which was part of the mysteries of the things he taught. So there you go, folks. Think about it. Fodder for thought. I'm going to go out for the weekend. You do too. Might see you on Sunday morning as usual on It's Sunday. So you guys have a good weekend. Sit tight.